Welcome to the Truth Exchange podcast, a unique program where we have conversations about worldview, all through the lens of oneism and twoism. This lens is based on Romans 1:25. We've exchanged the truth of God for the lie, worship and serve creation rather than the Creator who is blessed forevermore. I'm your host, Joshua Gilo, and today I have a special guest with me. His name is Pastor Mark Robinson. He's a teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church in America. He's an accomplished classical and jazz pianist. He minored in music at Bob Jones University, where he earned his BA and MA in religion. His MDiv was at Westminster Theological Seminary. Currently resides in Pittsburgh. Currently serving as part-time high school and Bible teacher, adjunct theology instructor, regular pulpit supply, and sometimes he contributes to evangelical and reformed blogs, as well as going to be a speaker at our upcoming symposium in 2021. Pastor Mark, thanks for being on the program today.
Oh, good to be here.
The reason why we're doing this podcast, Dr. Jones framed the symposium with a question. He says, how should Christians articulate the deep truths of the gospel in today's caustic and hostile culture? Like never before, we are facing massive divisions within the culture and within the church. We're divided over how churches and beyond that, businesses, schools should function during COVID-19. We're divided over how Christians should vote. We're divided over, to some extent, on issues of sexuality and identity. We're divided over issues of race and social justice. These divisions threaten the charity and unity we knew in the past, which now provoke serious disunity and even expressions of sin. Such divisions go deep and threaten the state of biblical orthodoxy for years to come. Pastor Mark, when you look at the scope of broader evangelicalism across the globe, do you think that the church is moving forward in a right direction of unity, or do you think that there's much more work to be done on the issue of race? Excuse me.
Oh, the issue of race. There's always, because, this isn't the eschaton, there's always work to be done. So any issue you could mention, any issue, since we're still living within a fallen order and the church is, moving toward the new creation, you have to say yes to any issue. Now, is it as much as the world would lead us to believe, or as much as zeitgeisty Christians say it is? No. So the Church of Jesus Christ has always been, throughout history, on the leading edge of bringing social cohesion, social reconciliation, justice, poverty alleviation, all those kinds of things. It's Christians that have led the way for the most part. I mean, there are no atheist hospitals, right?
Right.
Hospitals were Christians. And
right.
So race, reconciliation, those issues, the church has always been, not without its foibles, of course, because it still participates in we're still not in new creation yet. So that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, there's always room for improvement, but nowhere near what is being posited of the church, on the church by the world.
Let's define some terms. How would you define racism?
I think theologically, simplest way to define it is sinful partiality based upon ethnicity and race. I put sinful because partiality itself is not wrong. Paul says, you should care about those of your own household more than others, else you're an infidel. So there's going to be natural partiality that's demonstrated to some people according to, the order of love. We love some people more than we love others by nature, in accordance with the way it's supposed to be. We love our parents and children and spouses and family more than we love someone we don't know.
And that's not bad.
Yeah, that's a very good thing. It's natural. It's the way the world goes on. It's just the way societies are built. But sinful partiality would say, because of your ethnicity, because of your racial designation, I will treat you, a certain way. I will not afford you the kind of justice, what is due to you, that I would give to other people who are not of your race or ethnicity. So I think, respecter of person, sinful partiality, it's probably the simplest way, I think, theologically to define it.
Yeah. When do you think, if you could pinpoint, that the sin of racism began to creep into, well, let's just deal with the West, the Western church?
Well, in terms of its biggest or its most notable manifestation, black and white, right? African diaspora members and European colonialists, whatever. I'd say the colonial period of transatlantic slave trade. And as soon as Europe bought slaves from Africa and shipped them over as they came to colonize the Northern Hemisphere, eventually what happened was they had to start giving arguments for why there was such a stark distinction between the European colonists and their African slaves. Right? We always make definitions for to explain the social hierarchy in accordance with the way we want it or how it's actually operating. And so this is where I think you see some of the what are they, biologists? I don't know, 19th century biologists. They start making all these kinds of arguments about size of the brain determines intelligence and capacity. And so I'd say the slave trade kind of drove, I think, our modern Western racial consciousness and the ways we conceive of race relations and our definitions of racism. It seems to be predicated upon bringing over slaves to the New World during the colonial period and times.
And then,
because before that, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I don't think the conceptions were the same. Like when you read about Greco-Roman conceptions of ethnicity and race, it was more a difference between those who were cultured and civilized and versus barbarian.
Right.
It wasn't color-based, although, we notice color. I mean, we're physical beings.
Yeah.
But the major differentiations when you read, I'm reading a book by Eileen McCloskey about race and antiquity, and she makes the point that the way they explained difference was on the basis of who was capable of civilization and who didn't seem to be. So barbarism versus Greek. A Greek was considered civilized and educated, right? And you see it in Plato and Aristotle, the way they arrange social hierarchy and things like that.
Right. For things like systemic racism, I had been listening to an interview that you were on with 3 other pastors.
Oh, yeah.
I think you filmed it back in June in the RPCNA. I cannot think of the name. But it was brought up, the issue of systemic racism. And what struck me about in that interview was when systemic racism was talked about, the first organization that came up in discussion was not America is systemically racist, but the institution of Planned Parenthood.
Yeah. Right. So, okay. Yes. So what I meant by that is to say, because the figure I hear is 8 or 9 out of 10 Planned Parenthood clinics or mortuaries or child sacrifice mills is in lower income Black or brown communities. So obviously the placement is telling you what they're trying to do. And who has the most abortions, right? Black communities, Black women. So that's a system, that's an ecosystem of child sacrifice that is heavily weighted, right? To have the outcome of many, many, many more Black women having abortions than non-Black women, than white women. So I say that's racialized. It's as racialized as any system anyone can point to and say this is systemic racial discrimination. I don't think we have institutional racism in the sense that, where the laws actually define that race determines a certain right or a certain privilege, right? We don't have that anymore. We don't have, like, you can't own land if you're German, or you can't like apartheid or whatever, right? You can't go to school if you're a certain tribe or a certain race. We don't have that, obviously. So in that
Right.
sense, systemic racism, but we have racialized outcomes.
Yeah.
Systems that work in such a way that it almost might as well be defined by race.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Planned Parenthood abortions kind of work that way.
Yeah. We see massive disunity right now politically on this issue. You don't have to watch much of the debates from last night or several weeks ago. Is the president racist? Is he not? Is certain political parties racist fundamentally, or are they not? So and lots can be discussed about how will politically racism be handled. How should churches handle this issue when racism comes up? I think about in 2016, the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, did a report on the issue of racial reconciliation. So I'm curious about your thoughts about what's the right direction forward. You think back to the 60s in the early 50s or late 50s in the civil rights movement. Should Presbyterian, Anglican, broader evangelicalism been there to be on the doorfront of cultural engagement for racial reconciliation, fixing racial dysfunction? How would you tackle that?
Yeah, so I want to say that the church, as long as it's been in existence, let's say just the New Covenant Church, it has its own lexicon of reconciliation. It's called neighbor love, confession of sin, forgiveness, image of God, right? James 2 says, why don't we curse humans? We don't curse them because they're made in the likeness and similitude of God. So we have a lexicon, and the church, when in its birth, was fighting these kinds of interracial, Greco, Greeks versus Jewish, right? The various different kinds of cultures were struggling to come together in the nascent period of the church. So this is not, I would say, I've set that context to say the 60s with all the racial upheaval, right now with all the new neo kind of justice concerns with Black Lives Matter and other racial things and police brutality and things like that. There's nothing new for the church. There's been strife as long as there's been humanity. The first murder was intraracial, not interracial. It was Cain and Abel, right? So I would just say the church needs to be about the business of putting on display what the reconciling power of God looks like. Confessing our sins one to another, forbearing with one another, forgiving one another, loving our neighbor. Neighbor's not colored. It's not racialized. It's the person in proximity to us, and especially if they're our enemy. So as the church just embodies that, it will be doing what it's supposed to be doing in a time of racial upheaval. So I don't know that there needs to be a special programmatic approach. I mean, we have a lexicon. We have a canonical lexicon. We have theological truths and principles that direct and guide us as this community, which is which is a display of the wisdom of God, the manifold wisdom of God in the world, by bringing together people who were apart, strangers and aliens, and making them brothers and sisters and family, and all participating in the multinational, multi-ethnic family of God and Abraham. So as the church just embodies that and does that in its normal practices, we will be doing what we're supposed to do. We don't need to get histrionic in any particular period of time. Though I would say your context will sometimes drive how much you have to concern yourself with it. The churches in the 60s in the Deep South, where you had incredibly, tense, acrimonious race relations, and where, which was ground zero for civil rights. Of course, a church in that context is forced to address and engage it because it's their day-to-day reality, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't that doesn't change what the church is called to do. The word, sacrament, preaching of the word, and discipline. The marks don't change because of the context.
Let's talk a little bit about that context. The first time I heard about this, a burden of in Reformed circles to be a multicultural, multi-ethnic, was about 2005, and a friend of mine went out to plant a church in Virginia, and he said, I'm planting a multi-ethnic, multicultural church in the PCA, and I would like you to move. This is when I lived in San Diego. I live now in Columbia, in South Carolina, so I've come to the South. But he said, I want you to move. I want you to consider and prayerfully consider moving out here. And I said, well, why do you really want me to come out here? He says, well, one, because you're Jewish, and two, because you've got tattoos all over the place. And so I want I want that diversity within my church. I thought that's interesting. How much of burden is that necessary? I think, if a church, if someone is called to an area, you think that the person is somebody who is just sent out into the field and whom God brings to the church and saves, becomes a part of that church. Is that an unnecessary burden to say I have to make sure my church is multicultural, multi-ethnic, when there's only really one kind of culture perhaps in that area?
Right. Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, you put it that way. Yes, that's way too much of a burden. I think it naturalizes a spiritual institution. Like, what's the qualification for a minister or pastor? Paul lays it out, right? He lays out 21 qualities, and he's not being exhaustive, but he's basically telling you, here's what a minister should be. None of them are sociological, right? They're spiritual graces. Can you lead? Can you teach? Do you have self-control, right? You're not getting drunk. You're in control of your appetites. You're knowledgeable. You're able to communicate the word. It doesn't even tell specifically how knowledgeable you are of the word, but you're able to communicate the knowledge you do have of the word. So those qualities are not sociological in the first instance. They're spiritual and theological. So a church is a ministerial and spiritual institution that we got to be careful if we apply things like quotas and diversity quotients for leadership. But having said that, there is an aspect of contextualization. If you're ministering in a place where the language is a tribal language, you're certainly going to want someone who's fluent and probably born and indigenous to that area to be raised up to minister, right? So we should not lead with contextualization and cultural sociological factors, because that's the nature of the church. Is not as first sociological. That it is a social institution, but it's one that's created by Christ. Christ is the head of the church. He raises it up, he builds it, he calls ministers. So I just always want to be careful that I'm not concerning myself too much with the kind of contextualization and imminent issues of kind of flesh and blood in society more than spiritual. But definitely say, and I encourage pastors, and I myself have prayed, Lord, it'd be great to see a diverse group of people raised up in this area as a testimony to your reconciling power and love. But that's driven by prayer. Yeah. That's driven, by prayer and the gospel is the most inclusive, contextual, unifying message ever. So preach the gospel, pray, and let God bring about the results.
You said that a number of days ago on social media. You said the gospel of Jesus Christ is the most racially inclusive, contra-racial supremacist, and anti-CRT message the world has ever known.
Yeah.
Why is CRT, critical race theory, an antithesis, if I could put it that way, to the gospel?
Well, yeah. So, from what I can see of it, and I've just probably for the last year been just trying to get myself a little acquainted with what's going on. It has materialistic, worldly presuppositions. right? It does not proceed from belief in the triune God over all, who's the creator of all things and has made us in his image, and we are fallen in Adam, and the only thing that can fix that, the only thing that can make things as they ought to be is redemption that is brought through Jesus Christ, and that all men are sinners in Adam, just as all men are common image bearers. It doesn't proceed from those kinds of basic assumptions about the nature of reality. It seems to, it has this kind of dualistic assignment to, oppressor, oppressed. And then in our situation in America, it assigns that on the basis of race, right? So if you're white, you're naturally an oppressor, it seems. Now, I know people would quibble with all this, but functionally what comes out and practically what comes out is white people are bad, black people are innocent, noble victims. So it's almost Manichaean. It's almost assigning a sort of moral virtue and quality to one race, and a negative quality to another group, purely on the basis of race or skin color. So our anthropology says we're all fallen in sin, and the oppressed become oppressors if you give them power. Why is that? Because we have Adam's blood coursing through our veins. So I think a lot of the presuppositions are wrong. It's negative. It's always positing. It's suspicious. The critical race theory stuff I've looked at is similar to the critical Bible, higher criticism, and some of the critical Bible theories, if I could put it that way, that I read in seminary. It starts with suspicion and doubt, and it denies supernaturalism, and denies it denies twoism, right? The God is the creator is over the creature, and it brings everything down to the level of the creature. The Bible's just a natural book according to higher criticism. It's finding contradictions. I find out with critical race theory, it just finds where all the power moves are as it looks at a law or policy or an institution. It's just all it sees, it seems, is just what is suspicious, who is trying to take advantage of who, and so there's just all those faulty presuppositions that come out: the oppressed, the oppressor, the hegemony, how racism it denies basic doctrine of sin, it denies sanctification, that we can grow in grace, that people can not be racist who were, because it just says racism morphs, it doesn't go away, I guess. So, and I know people quibble every time I've gotten in discussions about this. They'll say, well, that's not every critical theorist or whatever, but there's enough of a common strain, I think, in some of this. So the gospel's on a collision course with that. It says all men are sinners. All men need the reconciling power of the gospel to experience it. It doesn't just say certain people are a certain kind of sinners and other people are certain. It's not imminent. It doesn't just deal with material categories here. It deals with the reality that we live before God, and we will have to deal with God. He will judge the world. So it just turns upside down and disregards all the kind of classic systematic theological categories that we Reformed folk know and love.
I don't want to call out names on this podcast, but I'm thinking of a number of organizations and even ministers who I might consider are playing footsies with critical race theory. And you see nights of repentance or nights of moments of silence. And is that helpful? Is that a move in a right direction for some of these tragic events that we have just seen over the past 2 years, maybe 5 years, with the deaths of certain people? Is that a good gospel, Christ-centered way of moving forward, or is that stepping back into something that and getting into something that we don't want to get into?
Wow. So here's what I want to say. Maybe I'll regret this later. I don't know. My first thoughts, and I'm thinking of some of the instances where those things have happened. My thought is, first is, yes, it's always good to lament and to acknowledge our sins as an individual, as people, right? We're covenantal. So we believe God works in groups, right? He works through his people, and and we're interconnected. We're all part of the body as believers. So it's good to acknowledge sin, to lament it, and that's often a missing aspect. But here's the thing: if we're going to lament sin, we need to lament all of it.
Hmm.
We can't be partial and just lament the sins of white people. What you see again? We can't constantly just divide the world up into, guilty white people and victimized minorities or people of color or whatever. That's just not how our anthropology works as Christians. So I say yes, lament sin, but here's where I have a problem with all these lament sessions and things is it's almost always about 100% what white people have done that's sinful. And it just leaves guiltless people of color. I mean, I know people get upset, like we're blaming the victim or whatever, but we actually need to lament things, like George Floyd was high. He had been, there's a lot of issues that led up to where he was put in this situation where the Minneapolis policeman put his knee on his neck. Why do we only talk about what the police do, what white cops do, I guess, specifically, and not the sins that bring people into these sad situations? Like I put a post up about Breonna Taylor, just wanting to highlight something that wasn't being mentioned, that it was really sad what happened to her. And I don't know everything that happened. Only the grand jury and the Kentucky Attorney General probably and the police that were there know. But I said, obviously one of the things that brought her to such a sad demise was the fact that she had this affinity for or was connected with, maybe because of her own lifestyle or whatever it was, these kinds of guys who would put her in dangerous situations. Right, and the Proverbs are very clear about a companion of fools being destroyed. But so I just want to add that I don't want to just focus on just that. It was really sad what happened, and there's always room for legal reform and police reform and things like that to make situations like this less likely. But back to the lament sessions, I have a problem with them, not in principle, but in often how they happen in practice. They seem to implicitly endorse a kind of anthropology that the only sins for which we need to lament are the sins of white people. So that's where I have the problem. So yes, let's lament, let's weep, let's confess, let's acknowledge, but let's go. It should go all the way down. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be superficial. It shouldn't be Manichaean-like. So that's kind of where my thinking is at this point. I always feel left cold a little bit when I've participated in them or watched them.
Yeah, and I want to keep moving forward on that piece about response. But you've mentioned the term Manichaean. Could you explain to our listeners what Manichaean?
I'm probably misusing it. I've understood like a Manichaean kind of, I think I read this in Augustine, or he was Manichaean before he was converted. Just this whole assigning a moral quality on the basis of a physical characteristic, right, or something, like saying rock beat is sinful, whereas a German hymnody is righteous or core, that kind of thing. So it's assigning kind of moral virtue or value on the basis of a physical characteristic or particular kind of use of a thing. So it denies the kind of structure direction dynamic, that a structure of a thing can be good. How you use it is what makes it sinful, evil, or good, righteous.
Right. So let's go back then to the moving forward. Certain organizations, they would do nights of lament. What kind of things can besides the preaching of the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, what kind of things can a pastor do? What can lay leaders, ruling elders participate, churches as a whole do to promote healing, and even, I don't even know how to put it, growing into that excitement, I guess, about multicultural, multi-ethnic. When I became a Christian, coming from a Jewish circle, I mean, you think of Jews, I've had my fair share of being treated poorly because I was Jewish. But at the same time, Jews have can have the same racist views towards non-Jews, right?
Sure,
Goy,
sure.
you know,
Right.
we see
Yeah.
there's a goy, walking to the other side of the street, using the goys on Shabbat to get our stoves to get lit, all these things, right? All because don't touch me. When I became a Christian, I was like, are you kidding me? Everyone is in here. I can. The women aren't divided on the same side of the sanctuary. I'm seeing blacks. I'm seeing Mexicans. I'm seeing this. All this. Like, this is wonderful. What way? How can we get excited about the diversity? Because I think of in John's Revelation, chapter 7. After this, I beheld, and lo, a great multitude which no man can number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, stood before the throne, before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands, and they cried with a loud voice, Salvation to our God, which sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb.
Yeah, I would say it seems simplistic, but again, when you really believe in the purpose of the church and God's economy of redemption in the world, then I would say when churches do things like when they endeavor to maintain the unity of the spirit of the bond of peace across cultural lines. So, and not just like, so I think this type of thing is caught more than taught. We shouldn't treat race like we're in a lecture hall, but more in like a banquet hall thing, where I think people just need to get together. I think Christians need to gather around the same table. I think so that practically would look like just Christians that are different, that have different ways of looking at the world. And every time I look at a Barna study on politics and Christianity and how the races seem so disparate in their views, I just always think more and more, man, it would be just good to just get together, sit down, and just have real live koinonia. So this is not, because race, especially for minorities and African Americans, it's not primarily an epistemological issue. It's an ethical, existential issue that, we live it, we feel it. We feel the kind of biculturalism of living in America as a minority group. I'm sure you understand that, Joshua. So I think practical, ethical things, getting together face to face, sitting down, sharing meals together, partnering in the gospel, doing those kinds of basic ecclesiastical acts of love and unity. And I think that can help form the kinds of epistemological unity, kinds of theological alignment that comes from first practicing it. Right? You mentioned Revelation. It's every nation, tribe, kindred, tongue gathered around the throne singing. There's proximity there. So I think, just practically speaking, churches need to get together and do things more than just kind of doing podcasts, debates, and and even just conferences, but spending time together, breaking bread together, sitting across the table, partnering in ministry, things like joint services. I think all this kinds of church unity is local. It's not a global thing. It's like, we can't unite the church, but I can unite with my Christian neighbor who lives across the street, or whose church is just down the street from my own. So I see things like that, little relational matters that make it more than just epistemological debates, and it brings it down into the ethical and the praxis, not just orthodoxy, but orthopraxy. So,
last question. That's very, very, very helpful, and also very encouraging. I picture all that, and then about banqueting and the beauty of that. Let's say you're a small church pastor, or even a large church pastor, and you're wanting to do that type of thing of local unity, and the church across the street, though, embraces critical race theory, or embraces maybe a narrative that you feel is somewhat twisted. What's the way to walk in love, and to be able to get that banquet table set up for fellowship? Is it simply just biting your lip and just sit and keep having conversations. I always wonder about, I've always heard the importance of conversations, but at some point there's going to come a butting of heads.
Absolutely. Yeah. But that's always a starting point, right? You have to like open your mouth to the other person and they have to talk back to you. And then as you gain a little bit of credibility, obviously you can speak more directly as you are more comfortable, as you kind of build up that good faith capital with one another. You can speak more truthfully. So I would, when I have serious disagreements with a number of people on CRT and it's how it's antithetical to the gospel. And I have on a number of occasions just tried to talk with them. But if they don't want to talk, I mean, I guess you can retreat and try to come back at a later point and see if they can make some advance. But yeah, I mean, I just don't know that there's any magic formula or, beyond. God has made us embodied beings and has called us to love one another and to dwell with one another in peace and unity. And a lot of times that requires speaking some hard truths in order for us to grow together and be built up. And it's just a messy, I'm reminded of Paul Tripp's book, Relationships, a Mess Worth Making. So this is a mess worth making, is to really just try to talk to people across the ideological aisle. I don't know any other way. Really pray for unity and to pursue it in very practical, one-to-one, church-to-church kinds of ways.
Very helpful. Pastor Mark, thank you for being on the program today.
My privilege.
This concludes our episode of the Truth Exchange podcast, the unique program where we have conversations about worldview, all through the lens of oneism and twoism. Be sure to drop us a line, let us know how you think we're doing, or let us know about anything that you would like to see us address in upcoming episodes. Remember, this podcast is only made possible from friends like you.